Please be seated. The court is now back in session. Again, the floor is given to the prosecution to continue putting questions to the expert. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Short, before we proceed to look at some aspects of the treatment of urban classes, I want to take just a brief step back and look at one decision made, it appears, in early 75, and then this decision appears to have had some implications for what happened in April 75. You discussed earlier, when we looked at how some senior officials of the Khmer Republic regime had been turned back to Phnom Penh, and I think you said you drew an inference that that was a centrally made decision, or decision from up high. I want to look at a document that dates back to February 1975. This is one of the documents that we sent you. It's an extract from a Foreign Broadcast Information Service transcripts for February 1975. The document number here is E3/117. If you don't have a copy handy, I'll pass one to you. President, with your permission, I'll pass the expert a copy from our bench.
President, yes, you may do so. Court officer, could you deliver the document for the expert examination?
Thank you, President. This particular extract, and I acknowledge the writing is not very clear, it's a very small font, but I'll do my best to read the passages that I'm interested in for you. The relevant ERNs are Khmer 00242308-9, French 00281432, and English 00166773. This particular document is entitled, or this part of the transcript is entitled, Q Sampan Chair's NUFC Congress Session Communique Issued, and it was broadcast by Voice of NUFC in Cambodian to Cambodia on the 26th of February 1975. This is an extract from that communique, and I'm looking at paragraph 1. Quote, concerning the 7 traders in Phnom Penh, the National Congress has decided as follows. Traitors Lon Nol, Sirik Matak, Sonyok Tan, Cheng Hang, Intam, Long Beret, and Sustena Fernandez are the chieftains of the traders and ringleaders of the treacherous anti-national coup d'etat which overthrew the independence, peace and neutrality of Cambodia. And then skipping one sentence, on behalf of the NUFC, RGNUC and CPNLAF, the National Congress declares it absolutely necessary to kill these 7 traitors for their treason against the nation and their fascist, corrupt, criminal acts unprecedented in Cambodian history. And just before I ask you some questions, I'll indicate for the record that the communique is also contained in document E3/189, which is a letter that was submitted to the United Nations General Assembly. It's another document that we sent you, but we don't particularly need to look at it. It reproduces, in essence, this communique. I do note that elsewhere in your book you commented that you didn't think that this particular Congress actually took place So my question is, which body, if any, within the CPK structure or within the broader structure of the front may have been responsible for the decision, if you've been able to come to a conclusion on that?
There is no evidence, apart from this broadcast, of any such Congress taking place. This is like, seems to me to be like the appeal which was, or the message of support from Hu Nim, Hu Yun and Khieu Samphan, which was sent to Beijing at the time of Sihanouk's destitution. It was a document written by the Cambodian Communist Party leadership. Who exactly in that leadership, whether it was a document drawn up by Mr. Khieu Samphan, but certainly it reflected a decision by the CPK Standing Committee or by Pol Pot himself to reassure others that only those 7 named leaders, and I think other names were added to the list later on, but basically a very restricted number of people would risk the death sentence, would risk being killed when the Khmer Rouge took over. That was the object of it.
We saw earlier from a passage of your book that we looked at that you make specific reference to the execution of Long Beret. Now, the document is, this particular communique is signed by Khieu Samphan, according to this document. Are you aware of whether this decision in any form or fashion was communicated within CPK structures, within the hierarchies, or if is that not something you're able to ascertain through your research?
The fact that it was broadcast by their radio station, I mean, obviously amounts to dissemination. So it would have been made known. But what we really don't know is who was the decision maker who approved this document. We don't even know whether Mr. Khieu Samphan, whether it was simply a matter of using his name, whether he was privy to it before it was put out. All we can say with certainty is that this nebulous body or group who were at the head of the CPC certainly approved it and were responsible for issuing it.
And just one more question on Khieu Samphan in particular. In your research, have you come across any evidence of him distancing himself from this decision or disagreeing with it in that particular period when it was made?
Absolutely not, and I'm sure he did not distance himself. I'm sure he was in agreement with it and with the policies which were connected with it.
Thank you. The communique also mentions that others, lower-ranking officials, as you've already intimated, were effectively welcome that they have a full right, in the words of the communique, to join the front, the Cambodian nation and people, if they cease cooperating with the 7 traders. Are you aware of the resistance within the country implementing such a policy or approach of welcoming those who were on the Khmer Republic side if they came across?
To my knowledge, there is no evidence of that having happened in any case.
Thank you. wish to look at or build on one of the passages that we looked at, which was the breaking up of feudal classes, etc. And I want to see if we can elaborate on that by looking at a few documents. The first document is a revolutionary flag from August 1975. Now, you won't have a copy of this, but it's cited in your book. I had a look to make sure whether this was one of the documents you've relied upon, and it's cited in relation to page 341 in English, just for the record. I have a copy of it here for you, Mr. President, with your permission. This is document E3/5. It's the revolutionary flag from August 1975. If I can pass a copy to the expert.
President, yes, you can proceed. Court officer, could you assist the prosecution to deliver the document for the expert's examination?
Thank you, Mr. President. So looking at the view that the revolutionary flag adopts in relation to what it describes as private persons, bourgeoisie, feudalist classes, etc. The relevant TRNs are in Khmer 000633321, French 0053891, and English 00401-486. So that should be page 11 in the English translation that you have, Mr. Short. It's a rather long passage, but I'll try and read just a couple of excerpts. Under number 3, we see types of private ownership, and the publication goes on to say they have been subjugated to state ownership and collective cooperative ownership, and they are not concentrated, they are scattered, they have no forces, therefore they have no power to oppose. Since we do not allow them the opportunity to strengthen and expand, they will dissolve without fail. If we had left them in Phnom Penh, they would have had strong power. Then below, under point 4, it's a discussion of the class composition in the Kampuchean society. Point number 1, the feudalist class has been attacked and overthrown, which is consistent with what you've been telling us. A little bit below that, now the colonialists and imperialists have been overthrown, the landowners and feudalists have been overthrown, the capitalists have been overthrown, and the petty bourgeoisie has no one to rely upon. Therefore, they are subjugated to the state power of worker-peasant. 2 sentences down. All of these persons are the new peasants who came from the petty bourgeoisie, the feudalists and the capitalists. Their class has been overthrown. Their economic foundations have been overthrown, but their outlook and their desires remain the same. Therefore, they continue to be in conflict with the revolution. I'm particularly interested in that last part where, despite having been overthrown, these classes apparently continue to be in conflict with the revolution. Are you able to opine on that at all?
This is why they had to be sent down to the countryside to reform themselves, to reform their mentality, to be educated by the peasants. This was not a wholly new idea. The Chinese also sent people to the countryside to be reforged through agricultural labor, through working with the peasants. But the first section you read out, I mean, clearly that is breaking up the network among city dwellers so that they were no longer in a position to resist the regime. And the second extract is about demolishing individuality, demolishing private mental ownership, so you become at one with the masses. Might I just say, apropos of what we were discussing in answer to your previous question, there is one more point to be made. Although the decision, the announcement that only the 7 traitors would be killed and others not, would be read as a reassurance, the last line does have a condition. It does say that others will be welcomed provided they immediately cease their cooperation with the old regime. Now, in February, if they didn't immediately cease, that guarantee is no longer good.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that further clarification. Just one or two more brief passages on this issue of class. Now we're looking at Revolutionary Flag, July 1976, E3/4. This is one of the documents we sent you. And with your permission, Mr. President, I'll give Mr. Short a copy of the particular extract.
Yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you deliver the document for the expert examination?
Thank you, Mr. President. The relevant ERNs are in Khmer 000-62911 to 2, French 00349973, and English 002689118. Quote, becoming socialist requires class struggle between the worker class and the other classes, the dictatorship of the worker class over the other classes. If there is no worker class dictatorship over the other classes, socialism cannot be built. If there is no class dictatorship, the enemy will attack us. A little bit further below, example, we are building socialism in the cooperatives. If at any time we are careless, if at any time we get loose and relaxed about socialist revolution, if at any time we get relaxed and loose about the proletarian class dictatorship, they will certainly attack us. If we give them freedom to do so, they will attack us. And then it continues on with that general theme, so I'll stop there in the interest of time. If you have been able to come to a conclusion on this, I'd be interested in your view as to why the policy seems to be still focusing of an enemy that will attack us if we do not carry out class struggle between the worker class and the other classes. What does that relate to, if you could explain for us?
This is not unique to democratic Kampuchea. In Maoist China, throughout that period, 1949, especially from the 50s onwards up to Mao's death, the idea that class struggle was permanent, that bourgeois elements would continue to emerge and would have to be fought down, that bourgeois tendencies would continue to emerge, that was absolutely basic in China. A similar idea with which Pol Pot became acquainted when he was a student in Paris was set out by Stalin, that a fortress is most easily taken from within, meaning that the greatest danger to a communist party came from elements burrowing into its leadership and corrupting the leadership of the party. So it really isn't unique. What is unique here is that they talk about the worker, the proletarian class, exercising its hegemony over other classes. And I remember having long discussions with Mr. Khieu Samphan, which probably will not interest the court, about how you could have proletarian class stance when everybody was a peasant. He didn't convince me and I didn't convince him. But this was something which was very different about the Cambodian party, that it was essentially an alliance of intellectuals and peasants who claimed that they had forged intellectually this worker class consciousness, which would allow them to exercise hegemony over others, and thereby repress all those bourgeois tendencies that would emerge spontaneously unless they were clamped down.
Thank you. Now, looking at your book, at pages 321 to 322, you deal with a number of areas here, obviously, among them the hierarchy that the cadre were expected to maintain between base people and new people. The relevant ERNs are English 00396529 to 30 and French 0063987 and following. So, as I said, you first describe this hierarchy, and then you talk about the use of hunger as a punitive weapon. And then over the page, you say the following: the indiscriminate killing of former Republican army officers and senior civil servants, which had marked the first months of the regime, had stopped during the summer. But in the cooperatives, executions of supposed bad elements and others who allegedly violated collective discipline continued. Is there any relationship at all between this view of class enemy or class tendencies that are to be stamped out and the killing of supposed bad elements or those who violated discipline?
The one was the justification for the other. If somebody behaved badly in a cooperative, behaved badly picking up mangoes, taking food, even if it had fallen on the ground and was not being used by anybody, that was regarded as a manifestation of individualism rather than thinking of the collective. That was seen as bourgeois tendencies emerging in that person, who then risked the appropriate retribution. And where this system was different from almost every other communist system is that the appropriate retribution here was death. Whereas in China and elsewhere, it would have been re-education through labor, it would have been something to enable you to redeem yourself by work and then rejoin the community.
Thank you. Are you able at all to identify a point in time, looking at April 75 onwards, where this began? Was it continuous? Was it something that developed? Was it rooted in prior policies? If you can give us your view on that.
It's very difficult to be precise. It was certainly rooted in prior policies, and we saw it happening in the liberated areas before 1975. It then, I think, went, if you like, in waves. There were areas where the pressure became more intense on the cadres, and the cadres adopted a fiercer policy towards those beneath them, the ordinary peasants. There were times when things were easier. It depended on a variety of factors and was different in different locations.
Thank you. Now, continuing on from that, another aspect of the regime that you discuss in the book is what I'll describe for shorthand as a double standard, and I'll ask you to use your words and correct me if I've gone too far. This is at page 346, and then there is another relevant passage at 348. The ERNs are in French 0063 009909 and following, and in English 003965554 and following. At the first page, at 346, you say, all the leaders grew fat. Contemporary photographs show Pol and Nunchia looking bloated. Sampan put on weight and acquired an unhealthy reddish complexion. You then describe the ban on foraging, which, in your view, I think made matters worse for those in the countryside, including the prohibition on picking up fruit off the ground, which you've just touched on. And then just one more passage at 348, quote, but in democratic Kampuchea, the contrast was so flagrant that it became a caricature. Not only did a tiny, cosseted elite preside over the destinies of a nation of slaves, but the regime which that elite imposed made ideological purity, abstinence and renunciation, material detachment and the repression of the ego, the foundations of national policy, outweighing all other considerations. The ban on foraging was not an oversimplification by uneducated local officials. It was approved by the national leadership in Phnom Penh. Can I ask you to expand on that? And did I go too far in using the words double standard? I'll let you give us your elaboration on this contrast.
I don't think you went far enough in using the word double standard. It was particularly shocking because at both extremes, the people of democratic Kampuchea had nothing or so little, whereas in other communist countries where this kind of system, a nomenclatura system, the elite having access to services which are not available to others, the people had access to at least some things. If you think of China, if you think of Russia, the gap between the two was less. It wasn't because the DK leadership had absolute luxury. No, they had more or less what other nomenclaturas in other communist countries had. But in other communist countries, the ordinary people had more. Here, they had so little, the gap was enormous. And it's made more flagrant by this preaching of abstinence. One can find examples in history. I mean, the princes of the Catholic Church in the medieval times compared with the poorest peasantry, but still, these are not supposed to be medieval times. This was the 20th century.
Thank you. And just while we're on that page, there's another passage of interest further down where you look at concerns which you attribute to Pol Pot with respect to people being well-nourished or otherwise. And you say, revealingly, however, his concern was not that if collectivism failed, people would be discontented, but that individualism would re-emerge. He certainly knew that in some areas there was acute privation. Detailed reports from the zone leaders arrived on his desk each week, but either he did not wish to think about it or he regarded it as unimportant. This was not an exception, it was the rule. Whenever ideological principle and practical benefit came into conflict, principle won out regardless of the material cost. Can I first ask you to elaborate, if you could, on your findings in relation to this reporting mechanism and the degree to which information was reaching those at the top or in the centre?
There are copies of telegrams sent from the zones to the centre, which, although they don't speak of difficulties as being caused by the policy, of course they wouldn't. They would speak of sabotage, they might speak of natural difficulties, natural conditions, but which make very clear that things were not going well in particular areas. Ying Tarit, Ying Sari's wife, made a study tour of the northwest, and came back saying what she had seen was appalling, and of course it was all due to Vietnamese saboteurs. So the knowledge that things were bad, they knew about that.
And can you then expand on this idea that once in possession of that knowledge, you seem to conclude that the leaders took the view that the principle won out, regardless of the material cost, that ideological principle and practical benefit, where the ideological principle and practical benefit came into conflict, that the former prevailed.
Well, foraging is a very good example. It would have been, had people been allowed to forage, had they been allowed even very small vegetable plots outside their houses, then health and the mortality would have been much better, the mortality rate much lower, people would have been able to work more. It's pretty obvious, and the example of countries like China was there to show. Even at its most extreme, the Chinese never went to that extent. It was not permitted in democratic Kampuchea because of ideological principle. And there are many other examples of a similar kind where the regime did itself immense unnecessary damage, and the people unnecessary damage, because they were wedded to iron principles.
Thank you. Can I move on to another event which you describe? And this is now at pages 308 and 309 of the book. The ERNs are French 00639-853 to 854 and English 003965167. You describe a visit to the southwest in August, and that resulting in an understanding on the part of Pol Pot that things that rural cadres had known for months, in other words, that shortages of food and medicine were affecting the labour force. You then say the following: it was not the suffering that bothered Pol, it was the fact that lack of food might reduce their ability to work. Rather than bringing in rice from other areas, the best solution, he decided, was to redistribute the labour force in a balanced manner in accordance with the production needs of the different regions. That became the signal for another wholesale movement of the population. A little bit further down over the page, you say, now, just as the crops were ripening and they were looking forward to the fruits of their labour, they were uprooted to go to other areas where their muscle power was needed more. As always, the regime cloaked its intentions in a lie. You state then that it was more than 1 million people that were moved. Can I start first with dealing with the actual document that you cite for this? And the document, we have it on the case file, it's E3/216. It was one of the documents that we sent you, E3/216. It is entitled Tour of the Northwest Zone by the Standing Committee, or rather, Record of the Standing Committee's visit to the Northwest Zone. I'd like to give you a copy of this and see if we can resolve one issue in relation to where the visit was. Mr. President, with your permission, if I can give the expert a copy of this minute.
The President, you may proceed. Court officer is instructed to hand over the document from the prosecutor to the expert.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, I wish to clarify first this one thing about the location of the visit. If I'm correct, and please do correct me wrong, you may have been looking at a English translation at DCCAM, which does say that the trip was to the southwest zone. We've since retranslated that document, and it actually indicates that it was to the northwest zone, which would appear to be consistent with the rest of the decisions that are then made. But can I just first clarify that? Is it possible that we're looking at the same document in relation to this tour?
I think we must be, because the dates are the 20th to the 24th of August 1975 for both. It's a little puzzling in that the English translation I saw speaks of Kampong Som, which would correspond to the southwest, whereas we're talking here about towns in the north and the northwest. I can only assume, yes, you must be right, that this was a very inaccurate translation.
If we look at the page beginning in your version in English, I'll just see if I can. So this should be page 6 in English, just to make things easier for you, Mr. Short. The Khmer ERN is 00008492, French 00343. And English is 00850,978. So under that point number 2, quote, not yet in mastery of water problem, its human being strength is insufficient. The labour force must be increased. 300,000 or 400,000 more would not be enough. The current strength of 1 million persons can only work 50%. It's imperative to add 400,000 or 500,000 more. Now, does this decision relate, and if you're not able to answer the question, please let me know, based on information you've gathered and research you've conducted, does it relate to the movement which you then describe as taking place with people being moved to the northwest?
Yes, it clearly does. With the permission of the court, I would like, when I later today, after this session, to check, insofar as I can, with the documents that I may be able to have access to establish this, because I'm quite honestly puzzled by this difference of location.
That would be very helpful with the President's permission. I think that would be appropriate. Thank you. Now, just looking at the movement, you said in the passage we looked at earlier, as always, the regime cloaked its intentions in a lie. Can I ask you to expand on that? How did you come to that conclusion that this, again, was a lie?
The lie this time was that people would be allowed to go to their homes. Those who were from home villages elsewhere would now be allowed to go to them. And in fact, they weren't going to their homes, they were going to new collectives in the northwest where labour was needed.
Thank you. Now, moving on to another passage of this page. You say the following: it was not an illogical policy, but the timing was terrible. There was no way the Northwest could cope with hundreds of thousands of extra mouths, which arrived too late for their owners to grow new crops, but in time to require feeding from the wholly inadequate harvest planted for a much smaller population several months before. Moreover, it underlined the principal reason of the April evacuation. To Paul and his colleagues, The Cambodian people were no longer individual human beings, each with hopes and fears, desires and aspirations. They had become soulless instruments in the working out of a grand national design. Can I ask you to expand on that conclusion?
Unless I misheard you, I think the phrase says it underlined the principal lesson of the April evacuation, not principal reason. Yes, it's once again the idea that people are expendable, that the ends justify the means, that the goal of making Kampuchea strong and prosperous outweighs any considerations of the well-being of the population in the short or medium term.
Have you been able to consider in any detail the effects that the decision and the movement had on those that it affected?
I hesitate. I think there are, not statistics, but there are indications that those who were sent to the northwest had a singularly difficult time. I talked to a Chinese interpreter in Beijing who had been in Cambodia, Democratic Kampuchea, that autumn, and who described seeing these endless trails of people marching on the roads going from the south to the north. So the reality of the mass movement of population, there are eyewitnesses who can testify to that.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to a whole new topic, and I do realise it's late in the day and you must be getting tired. The next topic I'm going to deal with has to do with the events which I believe you described mostly in a chapter called Stalin's Microbes. Essentially, the enforcement of a security apparatus, the purges within party ranks, and also the way that might have affected those outside the ranks. But I want to start first with what you seem to be describing as a view that the leadership took with respect to those that were being evacuated. And I want to see if that informs this discussion, at least insofar as those outside the ranks is concerned. This is at page 283 now. The French ERN is 006 39820. English is 00396 And in fact, if you turn over the page, and just in the interest of time, I'm going to read a shorter part of this. Quote, "Soldiers everywhere are trained to secure their objectives without paying too much attention to the damage they cause along the way. In the case of the Khmer Rouge, this was compounded by ignorance and extreme youth. Nonetheless, the political context which allowed them to act as they did had been defined over the previous decade by Pol and the CPK Standing Committee." A little bit further down, different leaders with a different ideology might have chosen a policy of national reconciliation. Pol decided otherwise. To him, the city dwellers and the peasants who had fled to join them in the dying months of the war were ipso facto collaborators and had to be dealt with as such. In the next paragraph, a brief sentence, "Soldiers were urged to cut off their hearts towards potential enemies, a category which included all urban deportees." Can I start with that last part, the view of all urban deportees as enemies and the instruction given to the soldiers?
I would simply say it's consistent with everything we've been describing about the ends justifying the means, about making a clear line of demarcation between the enemy and ourselves, about those who chose to vote with their feet and stay in the cities rather than joining the revolution being untrustworthy. I would say one more thing. I wrote those with a different ideology, a different approach might have chosen national reconciliation, but that implies trust. If you reconcile with a different group, you are giving them your confidence, you are showing that you trust them to work with you. And one of the characteristics of the Cambodian Communist Party was there was a total lack of trust in all those who were outside the party, and indeed suspicion of those who were within, which is what led to the purges. Lack of trust was fundamental to this regime.
I want to turn to a concept which I don't think we've touched upon just yet, and this is from a Revolutionary Flag magazine again, this time the October to November 1975 edition. We've sent you a copy of this particular document as well. Mr. President, this is E3/748. With your permission, I'll give the experts the pages that we'd like to cite from.
The President, you may proceed. Court officer, please get the document from the prosecutor and hand it over to the witness for his examination.
So in the copy we've just handed you, Mr. Short, it should be on the second page, the passage where I wish to start. The relevant ERNs here are Khmer 0063238 and following, French 00499-685, and English 00495-802. Again, it's a long document, so I'm going to try and be selective. Quote, the robust organisational stance under the party class organisational line means we shall never condone any carelessness that allows the enemy to infiltrate and burrow from within the party the revolutionary rank in the present and in the future. And in the next paragraph, the second sentence, when the party has taken full power and control across the country, the revolutionary vigilant stance became even more important, since it is an essentially basic factor conducive to the rapid victory in the national defence and reconstruction. In the absence of revolutionary vigilant stance, the revolutionary enemy can regain their powers. Thus, the revolutionary at any time has to strengthen his or her revolution vigilant stance in order to eliminate any secret and overt tricks of any kind of imperialists, in particular the American imperialists and its lackeys. Then and only then we can successfully defend and rebuild our nation. Just looking at the time of this document, being from October, November 1975, and I know we will get to the events of 1976 that you describe in the book. Could you opine as to the introduction or the use of this concept of enemy burrowing from within and the need to maintain revolutionary vigilance at this stage of the regime?
Again, it shows consistency. It is, you're quite right, it's early on, October, November, because it was probably written in October, November 75, at a time when even from the standpoint of the regime, the burrowing in of enemies of the revolution was not a very obvious problem. But I think one can find precursors of this kind of document going back before 1975. That has been their consistent standpoint. And when the relationship with Vietnam became more difficult, 1976 and so on, then what had been partly theoretical up to then became much more a matter of practice.
Now, moving on to the events of early 1976, and this starts from page 354 of your book, which I believe is an entire new chapter. I won't be reading immediately from that page, but I'll go to the page following, again in the interest of time. The ERNs are French 00639921 and English 003965563. You're describing here an explosion that had taken place in Siem Reap. And then on the following page, or rather at the bottom of that page and then the page that follows, you say the following. At the end of March, Hu Nim informed Pol of a scandal involving Khoi Tun, the former Northern Zone Secretary, who was now a Minister of Commerce. And he described the specific information that was provided to him in relation to Khoi Tun. Then you say, to Pol, this raised serious questions. Tun's behaviour went against everything the revolution stood for. Siem Reap was in the zone he used to head, and Sot was a long-time associate. Could Tun have been implicated in the Siem Reap event? On April the 8th, the minister was placed under house arrest at K1, the former bank buildings where Pol had made his headquarters. Another Northern Zone veteran, Dun, the director of the Central Committee's General Office, was appointed to act in his place. Soon, evidence emerged that Dun had been privy to Tun's activities and might have covered up for him. In the hothouse world of democratic Kampuchea, it began to look as if there were a Northern Zone conspiracy to overthrow the regime. Can I ask you, I'm dealing with a number of events, again, in the interest of time, but can I ask you to opine as to the significance, if any, of these developments for what was to follow?
It's not clear whether the centre, that is Pol Pot and Nuon Chea, ever really got to the bottom of what had happened in Siem Reap. Certainly something happened. There were reports to the Standing Committee, which we have minutes of. Ieng Sari said to me it was an uprising. Something serious happened which bothered them. And then these other kind of lateral factors became involved. For a regime which was very prone to paranoia, it was easily depicted as a conspiracy. And if there's a conspiracy, how far do its ramifications reach? This was the first incident of its kind. So it was, if you like, the trigger for the theoretical vigilance, which we looked at in November 75 and went back earlier, to start to become a necessary attitude. Necessary because there was apparent evidence of attacks, conspiracies against the regime. Therefore, you start looking at that. Therefore, you start looking at other possible conspiracies. So it was important.
In this part of the book, and indeed in the passage I just read, you referred to an individual called Sot, but elsewhere in this part, you describe how he reported to the Standing Committee on the investigations of the Siem Reap event. I'd like to show you a document now, which is another document that we've sent you. This is a minute of meeting on base work. It's dated the 8th of March 1976, and the document number is Mr. President, with your permission, I'll give the expert a copy.
The President, you may proceed. Court officer, please bring the document from the prosecutor and hand it over to the expert.
Mr. President, with your permission, we can also display it on the screen if that's of any assistance, at least for those who can read Khmer. We have a Khmer version that can be displayed.
The President, you may proceed. AV assistants are instructed to put the document up on screen as per the request by the prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. President. If we look at the first page of the document, Mr. Short, what will appear on the screen will be the Khmer version, the original. The composition of the meeting, we see Comrade Secretary, Comrade Deputy Secretary, and Comrade Hem, as well as Comrade Dawn. Just for the record, can I ask you to identify for us who you understand those individuals to be?
Comrade Secretary is Pol Pot, Comrade Deputy Secretary is Nguyen Chia, Comrade Hem is Khieu Samphan. Enough?
And Comrade Dawn?
Comrade Dern, in my head, I simply knew him as Comrade Dern, and that is how he's referred to in the book. It is obviously a revolutionary name. We need go no further, perhaps.
Indeed, but to confirm then, it's the same Dawn that we saw.
It is indeed the same Dern we've been referring to. He was the head of the Central Committee General Office, which was an absolutely key position.
What is interesting about this document is that it appears to contain or record reports by three individuals, Shreng, Sot, and Hung, from three different sectors, 303, 106, and 103. 106 is Comrade Sot, individual I think we referred to, and his reports indicates that no clear roots of the events in Siem Reap on 24 February have been discovered. Is that the information that you were looking at when you wrote that passage in the book we looked at?
It is indeed. This document is the source for that.
Now, taking a step back and looking at Shreng's report in relation to Sector 303, he says, or rather the report says the following: Comrade Shreng reported to Angkar on the activities of our Loon group and their associates, 34 persons whom the zone military have all already arrested. The group of Ah Uk Mon, alias Uk Hong, which attempted to flee to southern Vietnam, and 4 or 5 of their associates, and asked for instructions from Angkar. And just in the interest of time, I'll read one more passage and then I'll ask you some questions. Hung's report in relation to Sector 103 includes the following information. As for the entire sector, there is no enemy activity, just groups fleeing in from different locations, like fleeing from 303 or from Kampong Chhnang. Since January, almost 100 have been arrested. As far as your research takes you, does this reflect a general practice of reporting to leadership? And because it does seem to be fairly specific, there are names given and numbers of people arrested.
It's very typical, in my judgment, of the documents of that time, either telegrams or minutes of standing committee meetings, yes. Details of conditions in the base areas, of disruption, people fleeing. This is absolutely standard material.
Mr. President, I'm mindful of the time. Would you like me to stop at this stage?
The President. Thank you, Mr. Prosecutor, and thank you, witness, the expert. The time is now appropriate for the day adjournment. The Chamber will adjourn now and resume tomorrow on Wednesday, the 8th of May 2013 from 9 o'clock in the morning. We will resume the hearing of the testimony by the expert, Philip Short, and the question will be put by the prosecutor in the morning and followed by the lead co-lawyer for the civil parties. And then in the afternoon, the floor will be given to the defense team, beginning with the defense team for Mr. Nguyen Chia. Mr. Philip Short, your testimony has not yet been concluded, so the Chamber would like to once again invite you to come to provide your testimony again tomorrow morning. And court officer is instructed to coordinate with the vessel unit in order to assist him in his transport and arrangement for him for the day, and have him back in this courtroom before 9 tomorrow morning. And security guards are instructed to bring the co-accused back to the detention facility and have them return to this courtroom before 9 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Nguyen Chia is to be brought to a holding cell downstairs so that he can follow the proceeding by remote means. The court is now adjourned.